Welcome to the Sports Spectrum Podcast, where faith and sports collide. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
Welcome, everyone, to episode number 15 of the Sports Spectrum Podcast. My name is Jason Romano. It is great to have you joining us here today on the program. Today's podcast is a different type of podcast than we've had before. This is a story of a young man named Taylor Haugen, who was tragically killed at the age of 15, 9 years ago. And this podcast is his story and the legacy of Taylor Haugen. And our guests today are Brian and Kathy Haugen, who are Taylor's parents. And Kathy is the executive director of the Taylor Haugen Foundation. Its mission is to build and recognize youth leaders and promote youth sports safety to honor the legacy of Taylor Haugen. Now, this was an especially difficult podcast for me personally because I'm a dad and my daughter Sarah is 13. She's our only child. And Taylor Haugen was Brian and Kathy Haugen's only child. And they lost him. And I don't know what I would do if I lost my daughter. But I read their story over the last couple months, came across the foundation, and I thought it was an important story to tell. I thought it was an important podcast to do, and it's not your podcast where it's a famous athlete or an analyst or somebody who you see on TV or read about or know a lot about. You may never have heard of Brian and Kathy Haugen. You may never heard of Taylor Haugen. And on their website, Taylor actually writes a letter, an essay, if you will, 6 days before he passed. And I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to read that essay in the interview, and I want you to listen closely to the heart and to the life that Taylor Haugen had within him before his death. He loved sports. He loved people. Most of all, he loved God. And I'm grateful and thankful to have this platform to bring the story of Taylor Haugen to you. So without further ado, here is episode number 15 of the Sports Spectrum Podcast. Brian and Kathy Haugen. Guys, thank you so much for being a part of this. And let's simply start this interview by learning about Taylor, about your son. Tell us about him.
That's always a hard one. There's so many things to tell. He was just a very dynamic young man, was always happy, quite the prankster, and, had obviously a passion for football that exceeded all comprehension in my book. Loved his family, loved his friends, loved God. He was just a very, very good young man.
He was very well rounded. He was very, very well liked and personable. He was he really looked out after the little guy. Always took care of kids and always took care of his friends and family. Just very, very very down to earth, very commonsensical. Very, very. I always say he's one of the most commonsensical men I've ever known in my life. And he was 15, but not to say that he wasn't, as Kathy said, a prankster. I always called him impish. He was always into trouble, but never really in trouble.
That's typical of a teenager, though, right?
Yeah, that's probably true.
Very true.
Absolutely. Now, faith and football, you guys mentioned them both. It sounds like were foundations of your family. Tell me about each of those sort of pillars and how important they were to not just Taylor, but to the entire Haugen family.
It's kind of odd. I guess Brian and I have always been football fans. One of my best friends growing up, her dad was a football coach at our high school. So I was just around it really starting from a young age. And I think a lot of his love for football came from being around us and watching it and the enthusiasm we had for the game. Because of just personal reasons. But he developed a love well beyond anything I think either Brian or I had.
And I would say that as far as the faith part, excuse me, the logically faith has been a huge part of our family from the beginning, and T owned it. I mean, T had a personal relationship with Jesus Christ that extended beyond his own personal boundaries. He was a spearhead to help bring other children to Christ. We are a member of a very large Methodist church here in Niceville. It sounds kind of ironic, but it's one of the top 10, I think, in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got a huge church children's ministry, and T would bring a lot of kids to the Wednesday evenings children's services every week, and it just was a key integral part of every part of his life, obviously.
Now, as a dad of a daughter, raising her, sort of right, if you will, or acclimating her to church and faith were very important to me and my wife. She's our only daughter. We only have one. And if you want to say it this way, we're trying to get it right. We don't have another shot, if you will.
Right.
So I'm wondering how did you go about raising Taylor and introducing him to God? Now, you said he had a personal relationship with Jesus, and I love hearing that. But I'm wondering from a parental standpoint, you guys, how you kind of walked that walk and kind of laid the foundation for him.
Well, it started very early. He was quite young when we moved to Niceville and we started looking for a church. I was raised Baptist and Brian was raised Lutheran. And so we really wanted to find something in between that we were both comfortable with.
That took a while.
and wanted to raise our child, within that denomination. And we immediately were drawn to this church and the pastor and staff. I taught Sunday school. Taylor helped out many times in my Sunday school classroom. Later on, I actually taught at our church's preschool. So it was something that was just very ingrained in our daily lives.
I would also add that we were very, as Kathy just mentioned, we were very involved in our church as well as involved with his aspects of church. So we would volunteer to go to Sabbath and Blitz and Rock the Universe and all the retreats that the kids would have.
Mm.
And I also was the small group leader for his middle school boys small group on Wednesday evenings. And that was just my way of making sure that I was, integrated into his Christian walk as well. And I don't think everybody has to do that, but I felt like that was what was necessary for T, or for us to raise T properly in that way.
That's great. Now, T, obviously, huge football fan. Tell me about his love for football and just how he lived that out. Obviously, he played football, and we'll get to his story in a moment. But his love for football.
He had a football in his hands 24/7. I think he slept with it. And he was at practice early and was the last one to leave. The thing about T that's very interesting is that even around here in Niceville, his jersey's the only jersey that's ever been retired by Niceville High School, and there's some big players that have come out of here. But and so a lot of the reputation now 9 years later is that T was a phenomenal football player, and in fact, the ironic twist is that he wasn't at first at all. I think I like to say that he started off in fifth grade as probably the worst player on his team, but he earned his way up to being a starter on the JV squad. When he was the sophomore, and he did it because he just never quit, never gave up. I mean, he literally just continued to focus, and he would stay there as long as there was somebody to throw him footballs. And I'd put him up against the fence, running back and forth, and throw footballs at him so he could catch them in the back and forth. And he was just determined. He was absolutely convincingly determined to get good at it.
Speaking of Brian and Kathy Haugen, they are the parents of Taylor Haugen and run the Taylor Haugen Foundation. This is always difficult, and I can't imagine even 9 years later what it's like still. But I'd like if you guys could take us back to August of 2008. Take us through Taylor as he was getting ready to play. You mentioned he was on the JV team. I believe this was the year he was playing JV football for Niceville. In Florida. Can you take us back to that time? What exactly happened, and just take us through the moments of that, painting the picture for the listeners?
Well, before Kathy goes into that, because she was there, I would mention very briefly that we had a hurricane that was coming in named Gustav. And I was still a member of the Alabama National Guard, and I was the deputy commander of a brigade that oversaw hurricane response. So I got called up to active duty, and I was really disappointed I was going to miss T's first game of the season, where he was his first starting role or position as well. So I literally had to leave and go, and I missed all that part of it.
Um, it's called our Kickoff Classic, and it's a game that's done every year. That particular year, it was done in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, so it wasn't at our stadium in Niceville.
Thank God.
And he was playing. He was playing wide receiver. He was thrown a pass a bit over his head. He jumped up to catch it. He was tackled simultaneously from the front and back, and ultimately, in the end, it crushed his liver. So it was actually described by one of the surgeons to appear to be a high-speed car crash. That was the damage.
He was able to somehow get himself up and off the field on his own.
He was. Okay.
And
actually, he tried to go back into the huddle.
Yeah, he tried to go back and huddle.
That says a lot about his not wanting to give up or not quit.
Yeah, and he was clearly in a lot of pain, but he wanted to go back in the huddle, and he got mad when he got called out. And I think he started to jog back and then walk back and stagger, and he blacked out on the sideline. Never recovered.
So at that moment, Kathy, you said you were there. Ambulance comes and takes him to the hospital. Is that kind of how it worked, or was it one of where you kind of just grabbed him and took him with you? Because you said he blacked out, but was he still conscious? Was he able to kind of know where he was in terms of getting to the hospital, or was that not the case?
He was in a great deal of pain. He was still conscious on the sideline. There was not an ambulance at that sporting event, so an ambulance had been called in. There was actually debate that went on as to whether we needed to flightline him. Then there was a problem with how far the helicopter was out, where that they could land the helicopter, and the ambulance was called in the interim. He did lose consciousness in the ambulance, and he never regained consciousness. They did work on him. They did emergency surgery in the emergency room, and then they did actually at least one other one from my recollection. A lot of that evening is a little blurry.
I can certainly imagine. Taylor obviously it didn't make it, and I'm wondering the moments, if you remember, Brian, maybe you can share, kind of rushing back obviously to be there. Just take us through the process. The grieving process is one that is personal for every person, in every situation, in every sort of tragedy that it comes into our lives. I'm wondering for you as his dad, what that was like, just finding out what was happening and then trying to process all of that.
Well, I don't know if I was in Army mode because I was in uniform and just come from a mission, but when I walked through the doors of the hospital, I had one of my pastors and hospital staff on my flanks, and I basically was like, what do we got? And they said that we have multiple lacerations of the liver, and my knees just buckled because I've seen that in combat, and it's never a good thing. And but I still didn't have any concept of the idea that it could be potentially fatal. But as that came to fruition, I really truly felt like I really confidently felt that the Lord's presence was extremely strong within me, because I felt like this was my calling. And I don't, that's probably a discussion for another time, but I just felt like I'd been prepared my entire life to potentially handle and be there for Kathy and for the foundation to come, I guess. Something like this, I guess.
How did you guys both process the loss of Taylor in the aftermath of everything that had happened. You know, that moment, certainly it was blurry, but like just processing it over the next, I don't know, 48 hours to the next few days, and what was that like?
I think we still are processing.
It really is. It's a continual process. And I can honestly say there are mornings that I wake up and I guess I want to believe, but it's still that shocking, that is not a bad dream. It actually did, happen, and we lost our only child. So I think it's just ongoing. We both really tried to, hide for a while. Immediately afterwards, I really disconnected with the whole world. To be honest, he was my whole world, so that was a very hard adjustment.
I want to ask you about your faith and how it was impacted by the death of Taylor. I know in talking to people, even myself, when the only thing that I can even compare it to for myself was the death of my grandfather, and that was about 11 years ago, 10 years ago myself. But I remember being angry at God and remember questioning him. I don't know if I was questioning his existence, but just questioning why he would do this. And
Yes.
I just wondered, I have to imagine that went through your minds, but what was that like? How was your faith impacted? And what kind of questions or emotions did you have towards God? Maybe you still have them, but just wondering in the immediate aftermath.
I was very angry with God, and I struggled with my faith, knowing that that's God. I'm not supposed to be angry. I wanted answers. I wanted to know, why on earth would he take such a precious soul that was, truly, a follower. He was a soldier of God, and that was really hard for me to try to wrap my head around. Obviously, I've accepted I'm never going to have answers on this earth. That hopefully will come later, and I have a lot of questions.
Well, I agree. We were very blessed to have a very strong counselor who's a strong Christian and a member of our church, and that was probably pivotal to a lot of our recovery, if you will. But we've learned that it's okay to be mad at God. He's got broad shoulders; he can handle it, and I think that's something that we place too much difficulty as Christians, and nowadays that we don't recognize that it's okay to be mad. Just continue to seek Him. And, Kathy always says, and I say, thank God for God. Because if it weren't for God, I don't think either one of us would be here today, from all this. But I just don't understand how people can get through something like this without God. I don't know how people can do that. I mean, you've got to recognize that there's something bigger and better than ourselves in this world. And you got to seek that out and find out, because then that's the only way you get some answers. You never get, of course, all of them. But at least you can get some peace from that. And that's the key. And that's what we just continue to try to do every day as we continue to try to deal with it and recover.
What was the outpouring of the community like?
Wow. That is a question nobody's asked us, by the way. That's a great question. 1,600 people came to his funeral.
They actually ran out of room in both our community life center and our sanctuary. And there were literally people outside standing.
Wow. What did that mean to you?
Our community, here is just, it is called Niceville. But
ironically, right?
It is, ironically, yes. But, just, it was overwhelming, the outpour from the community and the support that we actually continue to get from, our friends, our church, the community in general. We still have that.
he still has a bit of a cult following, and I don't believe it's because of the fatality of it. Perhaps, of course, in part, but it's because of what he stood for and who he was as a person and his personality. His middle school gym has now been named after him, and his jersey was retired at the school. And there's still magnets on vehicles all over town that have his name on it, and it's warming to see that there's such a legacy still there, and we try to maintain it by keeping the foundation going in his honor and helping if we can teach more kids about the way that he lived his life, maybe they'll seek to do the same and build that bridge between their relationship and that with Jesus.
That's great. We're definitely going to talk about the foundation in just a few seconds here. But I was on the website. I was on the foundation website, and there is a letter, I guess an essay that T wrote just a few days before his death. I believe it was 8 days before his death. And I was reading it, and I was really moved because it gave me a really great picture. It's one thing to hear people talk about somebody, but to actually hear it from their own words, I think really can help give people a great idea or paint a great picture about how Taylor lived his life and what kind of person he was. So with your permission, if you're okay, I'd like to read that essay and then just talk about that for a second with you. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to read this. It's dated August 22nd, 2008 from Taylor. It says timed essay. I assume it was like one of the first things he wrote in school.
It was.
It was, okay. Great. I will read this real fast and then we'll talk about it. It says, "Hey, I'm Taylor Reed Haugen. I prefer to be called Taylor, and I absolutely detest my middle name for no reason at all. I am named after my mother's maiden name, Taylor. I was born in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and when I was 6 months old, our family moved to Pensacola, and from there here to Niceville. My family is very small considering that I am an only child, and we have a dog named Maggie. Maggie is a pound rescue dog, and she looks like a German Shepherd puppy, but she's actually 7 years old. My dad is 5'10" and completely bald. He is I love that. He is a financial advisor in Destin, and my mother teaches preschool at our church. I don't think I have a favorite place, but if I did, it probably would be my bedroom. A motto for me is plain and simple: never give up, don't ever give up. I think of that quote every time I feel like quitting something, and then I drive on and push through the tough times. My friends are the best friends in the world. When I was younger, my mom gave me a saying to help me remember how to spell the word friends. She would say the I goes before the E because you'll have friends till the end. I know now that I will have friends till the end because they are always there for me, and I am always there for them to help them in their struggles too. I also play football. I am a wide receiver on the JV team, and my number is 80. I have been in love with the sport of football since birth, and the feeling of running down the field into the end zone is unforgettable and insurmountable. In the future, I would like to go to the University of Florida and become a sports agent out of Los Angeles. That's an interesting dream job, I guess, but we can talk about that in a second. I love sports and everything about it, and think I could be pretty successful. I could be a pretty successful man in the future. I know for a fact that I will be a rich man in the future, so I plan on donating money to the United Way and the American Red Cross. I love how you're chuckling because it's got to bring a lot of emotions to you, but at the same time, it just gives you a great idea of who T was, his sense of humor, how he loved people. What's your reaction when you hear that letter read?
Well, as I'm laughing, I'm tearing up as well.
Right.
But that really did encompass who he was. His love for his friends, his love for other people. He planned on being successful and giving back because that's just the kind of person he was. And I guess in some ways we set an example for him, but he really owned that. That was very much a part of him.
A lot of that stuff was news to us. We didn't know about the sports agent thing, but I find the part in there about being a retired special forces guy. I don't believe in coincidences, and there's a lot of things associated with T and his passing that are just so coincidental that they're not. And I think it's not a coincidence that he speaks suddenly very seriously in that mostly pun-ish essay about running down the field to catch a football that's insurmountable, a word that you don't normally hear from a 15-year-old.
Yes.
And he literally dies doing it a week later, and I just find that just to this day still shocking.
Now tell me about the idea of a foundation and where that came from. Obviously, you want to honor your son, you want to honor his legacy, but to actually begin a foundation, I'm wondering where that idea came from.
Well, the kids started selling T-shirts and things. All of his friends did to basically start a scholarship fund. Kathy and I were obviously in a very dark place and not really thinking thoroughly through any of that stuff. And then Kathy got a call from the school one day saying, "Hey, we have a check. What are we supposed to do with it?" And being a financial advisor, it suddenly hit me that geez, this is the kind of thing I actually do for a living. Manage money for foundations, and it hit me. I thought, wow. I mean, we got to start a foundation. We got funds that the kids have already been raising money for, and it was literally one of the three things that literally got me out of the bed and started helping me to breathe and put one foot in front of the other.
We did talk to his friends. There was a large group of them that had pretty much grown up together. And we asked them what they wanted those funds to go to, and they did share with us that they wanted it to be a scholarship. So in order to do that, we had to set up the foundation. I was pretty much in the shadows for quite a while on the foundation side of things. It did, obviously later, it's given me purpose, as it did Brian earlier on. It has later given me purpose, and the reason to get up in the morning, to not only honor his legacy, but to do everything I can to make sure, number one, his death is not meaningless, and number two, so other parents don't have to experience this. The education side of this is a very important part of the foundation for me. There was information out there I didn't receive, and now I feel like it's my obligation to make sure I inform as many parents, coaches, the athletes themselves, that there's things that will protect them better, at least.
What's the website? We'll mention it again at the end of the interview, but what is the website in case people are on their phones right now listening?
The main website is taylorhaugen.org.
taylorhaugen.org. That's HAUGEN.org. I watched a piece recently when I was, doing my research on the foundation and on Taylor, and there was a piece done by ESPN in College Game Day, and I couldn't help but kind of smile when I saw that Tim Tebow had taken an interest in your son and in his story. And I know Taylor was a big Tebow fan. Tell me what that meant, just again in the grieving process, but also in trying to establish the foundation and get that going.
Well, Timmy is an absolutely wonderful, beautiful, special person. Everything that you've ever heard about him is correct. He's absolutely a wonderful, big-hearted guy, and we were honored to meet him and to pray with him and to do that ESPN piece with him. And it was. I just wish T could have been there to see that.
Mm.
He was watching.
Yeah.
Brian talked about, how coincidental or ironic some of the things have been. They have continued on through the years, and I'm not even surprised anymore when things happen. It happened that year that it was the first time we awarded the Taylor Haugen Trophy. It was somewhat patterned after Danny Warfel's trophy.
Mm-hmm.
And we know Danny and have known Danny for a number of years.
He co-presents it every year with us.
Danny, of course, the Heisman Trophy winner from the late 90s Florida Gators teams. Wonderful person, doing some great work for the league.
And he's from here, too, so that's kind of...
Right. He is from Fort Walton Beach.
Gotcha.
So and Timmy ended up being Danny's Warfel Trophy winner that same year that we were doing our first trophy. So that's how all that connected, and that's why that Timmy co-presented our trophy that first year with us.
Birthed from the foundation now, in essence, and I was reading this on the website, there's 4 pillars that it stands on. Can you guys share with our listeners those 4 main areas of emphasis on the Taylor Halligan Foundation?
We have scholarships. There's actually 5 scholarships now within our local area. We do the Taylor Haugen Trophy, which is a 3 county-wide nomination from each of the high schools, a senior, and they have to reflect Taylor's character traits. Then we have the YES program, which is our youth equipment for sports safety. And then we have a youth program where we work kind of side by side with the FCA in our area to hopefully mentor and help them continue on with their walk.
And in regards to the trophy and the scholarships, the winners of those are based on the same character traits of T, which are the pillars of the foundation, and it's the academics, athletics, community service, leadership, and Christian faith, and each one also has to do an essay on perseverance in keeping with T's motto of "Don't quit, never give up," and that's what we see for the individual people who apply for scholarships, as well as for the nominees for the trophy each year.
I saw a piece recently that included Arizona Cardinals quarterback Drew Stanton and him hearing about Taylor's story and the foundation and wanting to be a part of what you guys were doing with the youth football safety. How much did that mean to you to have someone like Drew, an NFL quarterback, want to be a part of Taylor's legacy?
Oh, it's tremendous. Drew is a wonderful young man, and he wears the rib protection faithfully. I mean, he won't even practice without it on. So having him come on board and lend that legitimacy to the protection itself was just huge for us.
Yeah, the thing that was really touching is that, and we have to tell everybody, is this particular equipment, which is extremely high tech, very very modern, innovative gear. It's self-forming to each individual person's body, but it's like Kevlar. And it's commonly worn by pros in colleges. And there's 20 active quarterbacks in the NFL that wear it. But it's, like Kathy said earlier, it's unknown to most middle school and high school players, parents, and coaches. So when Drew found out about that, he was taken aback as well. And really, I feel like he really got warmed up to our mission, if you will, and trying to get the word out about this, if nothing else. And that's how we partnered, and we outfit his former high school up in Detroit, and then the next year we outfit a high school of his choosing in the Phoenix area with some support from the Cardinals. So we would love to continue to do things like that in the future and educate and equip more kids and partner with some more folks that can help us to do that.
It seems like it's just a no-brainer to me that high schools would want to be a part of this.
I couldn't agree with you more.
But kids are giddy when they get this gear because nobody really gets their head around how it works. It's so thin. It fits like, a second layer of skin, but it doesn't take an impact like a foam or plastic. It diverts it across the entire shield, like I said, like Kevlar. And when it self-forms, it gets hot and then it cools down, and that's when it gets hard. And the kids just freak out. They just can't believe they think of it as swag gear, and they get all fired up.
Well, it's all about the swag with the kids, right?
Absolutely.
Let me ask you where we are right now. And it's great that it's not just in honoring Taylor. It's not just, a foundation as far as, scholarships. And obviously those are wonderful things. But it's obviously a bigger goal here as far as safety and youth football. Where are we right now? And how far have we come? I mean, Taylor passed in 2008. So we're almost 9 years to the day when he's left us here on Earth. And I'm wondering where we are as far as you guys have seen and doing your research and talking to people regarding safety in youth football.
In this particular area of abdominal injuries, we have made much baby steps at this point, mainly because it's a very hard injury to detect. Any injury to an internal organ in the abdominal region, several of them are similar in symptoms. So it's hard to narrow down exactly which organ it is. We have partnered with University of Florida and have done and basically a seminar where, if in doubt, get them to the emergency room. I mean, that's the biggest thing. And obviously, from my standpoint, I don't want to do away with football. I've been asked that question in a number of interviews. I want our coaches and our parents to provide protection for our players so that they play and play smarter, play safer.
Yeah, and unfortunately, also I would add that I don't think we've come very far. When I look at, we're members of all kinds of other organizations like Youth Sports Safety Alliance and such, and when we go to these conferences, we find everybody's speaking about the same things. It's the issues that have already been raised to the level they deserve to be with regards to heat, stroke, and sudden cardiac arrest and concussion injuries. And everybody always says that we're there representing abdominal injuries, and everybody says, yeah, but that doesn't really happen very often, and fatalities are extremely rare. And I said, there's been just as many deaths from abdominal injuries in high school the last couple of years as there's been from concussions. And people don't really believe that, and it's because nobody's following it or covering it or studying it, but we are. And it is true. And as you see more helmet-to-helmet contact rules and cut, chop, block rules being instituted, the torso is becoming more and more of a target, and we fear that there's going to continue to be more and more problems, especially with the adolescents in that area.
But it sounded like when I heard you talking, Kathy, too, you guys aren't anti-football.
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Football is it's a great sport, and in a lot of cases, there are players that is the one thing. Their coaches are the one mentor that they have in their life. That they get so much more out of football than people realize when you start looking at teams across the nation. We've been blessed. We've been able to outfit teams in 13 different states. We've done over 4,300 players so far, and getting them equipped with this protection. And I know a lot of these young men that I have been able to get protected will go on and play in college. And that's an opportunity they may not have had otherwise. But to go back to what you were saying before, and what Brian was saying, it's not just football that we are seeing deaths from abdominal injuries. There was a soccer player a couple years ago. He landed on the knee of either one of his teammates or the opponent, but it ended up rupturing. If I'm not mistaken, it ruptured
spleen.
I think it was his spleen. It wasn't caught, and that's the other hard part about this particular type of injury. Lots of organs down there. Yes, you can live without your spleen, but if that's not caught in time, they will bleed out. We've had deaths with stomach ruptures. Unfortunately, a young man lost his life last year from a tear in his intestines. He did go to the emergency room. They ran tests on him. It was a small tear, and it was not caught. And he became septic and died a couple of days after the injury. So there's a lot more to this type of injuries to the abdominal region that are not being considered. There's injuries that are happening in a lot of different sports, not just football.
We're going to wrap it up. A couple more questions here with Brian and Kathy Haugen. For those that are listening and maybe grieving over a loved one, particularly a child that they may have lost, what kind of advice or encouragement would you give them?
Wow.
I hope and pray that they have a personal relationship with our Lord and Savior. I think that's probably the first thing that they need to look toward. And for Brian and I think that that's not only saved us from the grief of losing our only child, but I think it probably saved our marriage as well. So it's not an easy thing. Everyone says time makes it easier. It actually doesn't. You just learn different ways to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. Time does not heal all things. It just makes things a little more manageable. But I would say that, if you've just lost somebody recently, I would say just focus on breathing. Just breathe and just
Pray.
and then just take a step forward, a little step here and there, and just be prepared to realize that it's a sine curve. You'll have peaks and troughs, and those troughs come in at nowhere. And try not to time it at the same time as your spouse, because it's really hard.
Yeah, we still have rough times where just the impact of everything somehow falls down on you all at one time, and neither one of us can tell you what triggers it. It's always a different thing, very random, but we do try to not break down at the same time. That is definitely advice that should be heeded. Two of us breaking down is never a good thing.
Well, I really appreciate you guys joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. This is my last question. We asked this to pretty much every guest that's been on. It's been almost 9 years now since Taylor's death. Obviously, the process of grief is exactly the way you've described it, and exactly that word, a process. But for each of you in your walk, in your faith walk, we'll start with you, Kathy. What is God teaching you both right now? Kathy, we'll start with you. What is God teaching you?
To be patient is probably the first thing that at least leaps to my mind. I can't change the world, and I can't do everything that I want to do in one day. And it's going to take time. The other thing is just to seek Him out. Seek Him out daily. I don't have a set time that I pray. I pray literally throughout the day. So
Constant dialogue.
It is. It is. In my dealing with youth and young children, they look at God as their best friend. And I think that's probably, as innocent as that sounds, that's probably really, really good advice. He's a best friend that's always there for you.
Actually, I have a new saying that I don't think would make sense to anybody else but me, which is kind of typical. But coming from a somewhat checkered past and with a career being an Army, Green Beret guy, I've seen and done a lot of really bad things, and I'm just trying to clean all that out of my head and try to focus on being a better person. So I can be a little bit knee-jerk reactive, and I'm trying to overcome that. So I've come up with a new motto that the Lord has put in my head that is to say, I pray about what to think before I think about it. And that is to say, I'm constantly praying that my prayers are focused on what to think before I think about things. Therefore, I'm avoiding saying and doing anything that's inappropriate or sinful. But I know that sin comes in the mind first, and I'm trying to get that out of my head so that I'm praying about what to think about. And so I pray about what to think before I think about it is my new little motto I'm going with right now.
I love that. I just think as believers, we can all encourage each other to, we pray for things to come, or pray for healing, or pray for deliverance, or pray for even, patience and love. But to pray for sort of God to take captive of our thoughts before we even think them is not something you hear often, but something I think that's pretty powerful and pretty meaningful. So thank you so much for sharing. I think that's amazing. And I think it's a really great prayer that we can all take into account every day in our daily lives. So thank you for that. Guys, It's been great speaking with you. I know this has to be difficult anytime you do an interview, but I also think, there's going to be a lot of people impacted by hearing your story. And my prayer personally is that if one person is moved to, not just to be motivated or to be encouraged, but move to action in safety, especially for youth safety in sports. This is worth it. So let's go back again. Tell me how people can learn more about the foundation and Taylor's legacy and get involved.
The main website is taylorhaugen.org. From there, you can click on the link to the YES program. That will give them information about what we're doing in that area. And we're adding information as quickly as we can. As a matter of fact, we are in the process of rebuilding our websites. So we're hoping to get as much information on there as possible, and hopefully we will get more quotes, more feedback from some of these well-known NFL and possibly NCAA players that are using this equipment and benefiting from the protection.
Well, I hope your website crashes, and I say that with all love, because I want everybody to go reach out to taylorhaugen.org and to learn more about him and to learn more about all the great things you guys are doing. Brian and Kathy Haugen, thank you so much for being a part of the Sports Spectrum podcast and for sharing your story.
Thank you,
very
Jason.
much.
And that was Brian and Kathy Haugen here on the Sports Spectrum podcast, sharing the story of the loss of their son, their only son, Taylor Haugen, and a powerful story and a difficult story for me as a dad, as I mentioned earlier, even doing this interview and not sure even if I went in the right direction to ask the right questions. But I just think their story is one that was important to tell and could be something that could relate to a lot of people who are going through loss of some form or another. And we bring in Raymond St. Martin right now, who is the Director of Digital and Media at Sports Spectrum, and of course, The Increase. And Raymond, just initial thoughts on Brian and Kathy's story.
Wow. It makes me flash back to my freshman year, playing freshman football, and the very first play of that game, the quarterback dropped back, got high-load, and was in a wheelchair, the rest of his high school life. There's this passion inside of us to play that sport, but injuries are just so common, and long-term injuries. And then to hear, in that letter, this young person's love of life, and to hear his love for football, and to know that was written 6 days before he would lose his life, doing what he loved, just in this moment, it hits me really deeply, to think about that, and then to be there and with his dad. I think what I prayed on and meditated on as we were going through listening to it was how his father was coming out of this military mindset, still in it, when he shows up at the hospital. And it kind of gave me a sense for who his dad was, and then how God worked with it in his father. Like he comes in, the table's set, give me a status update. Here I am, Green Beret. What's the status? What's the plan? What are my actions? Let me do them.
Right.
And in that state, it was kind of weird when he said, when he spoke about how everything became clear that God was preparing him to be the leader of his wife and to create this foundation in his son's name in that moment. It's like he comes in and he wants his orders.
Yeah.
And he gets them delivered from God directly the way that he can comprehend it. And it made me think, like Jason, like, when God speaks to us in tragedy, does he speak to us as the people that he's created us to be, in the language that we can understand to do his work on earth in the midst of tragedy? And that's, I think, my big takeaway from that. And kind of the question I come out of this with is, how in the face of tragedy, when I face it, is God going to reveal things to me? And who has he programmed me to be?
Yeah, because tragedy, it comes to all of us. There's no way around it. It's just a matter of when, not if, in a lot of ways for any of us, because we're all going to go through losing loved ones. Tragedy, some from a worldly perspective would look at it and say that's just not fair. And I've had friends who've had children that were stillborn. I've had friends who've lost children at young ages. I've had the loss of my grandfather, who was 83 years old, was my personal tragedy. And he was 83. So people might say, well, he was your grandfather, but for me, that was my tragedy. But I still think about what happened to Taylor, and being a dad. If I was, put in Brian's shoes, or losing my daughter — I have one child, Sarah. If I was to lose her, I would hope that my faith would prepare me to be able to, process it, to walk through the pain with the Lord. I don't know if I would be, because I also think I would be angry. I'd have a lot of questions. My faith would be tested in a way, my faith in Christ would be tested in a way that I just wouldn't. I'm not sure. You can't predict that. You know what I mean? I'm trying to explain what I'm trying to say, but I don't know if I could react or even process or turn around the way that they did to making this into a positive. That's what really hit me was, and a lot of our similarities in what we're thinking here is the tragedy of being used by God in the midst of tragedy. I don't know how God could use me in the midst of a tragedy like this if that were my own daughter. I just don't know.
And just being open to it, I think hearing Brian's testimony in that moment, I think when we're faced with tragedy, I'll keep his words and his experience in my heart. And when I'm faced with it, I just pray that it opens me up to listen for God's voice and what he's revealing to me in that moment.
Yeah.
Now, if we're going to face tragedy, we are going to suffer, and we are going to grow through those moments if we allow ourselves to be open to what God is doing in our lives at that moment. And I just pray that us and anyone who's listening that might face tragedy can think of Brian's words and think of his circumstances when you're facing your own, and listen for God's voice in that moment.
Yeah, I think of the passage of scripture at the end of John when Jesus is talking about how in this world you will have trouble, you will have trials, you will have things happen. And he doesn't say it might happen. He says you will have these things happen. But then he says, which is the greatest, one of the greatest promises in all of the Bible, is take heart. He says, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And that is so powerful. And I think we saw evidence of that with Brian and Kathy, in understanding that Jesus is in control, that he's overcome the world, and that's who we need to trust and rely on during times of trouble, times of tragedy that we go through. And that's the most comforting scripture for me, and that's what immediately came into my heart as you're talking, Raymond, was knowing the comfort, the promise that Jesus has overcome anything that we will ever go through in this world. And that's comforting to know.
And also that Taylor had that relationship with Jesus already.
Yes.
It's like, we know that we will see Taylor in heaven.
Yeah.
as his parents, you have to know and feel so just convicted that he's not here on earth anymore, but he's there and he's waiting for you, and by the time he blinks, you're going to be there.
Yeah.
It's amazing assurance that we have in our faith. It doesn't make it any easier, to go through that. But I guess actually maybe in a way it does. And I pray that it does, for parents that face that.
Yeah, me too. Raymond, thank you. We're gonna end this podcast right now and just say thank you to everybody that's heard it and listened to it. And if you are going through a tragedy, just know that we're praying for you, and we're thankful for a God in heaven that sent His Son to die on the cross, so that we can not be alone during these times of tragedy. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Sports Spectrum Podcast.